Hello and welcome to Stop the Press. I'm Rob Chadwick and I'm a lecturer at Exeter College in journalism. I'm here with Bill Martin, who is 35 years in the business on both local and national papers as an editor and sub-editor and just about anything you can mention. Hello, Bill.
Hello, Rob.
Nice to see you again. And I'm here with Nick Copson, who is 20 years in the business working for Reach and loads of other people as a marketing consultant within journalism as well. Hello, Nick.
Hello, Rob. Hello, Bill.
And
hello, Nicholas.
And we have a guest again, which is fantastic. We have Adam Tinworth with us, who is the esteemed journalist of the blog One Man and His Blog. Hello, Adam.
Hello there.
Nice to meet you. Adam, can we start by you telling us a little bit about yourself and your history and what's led you to this point, as it were?
So, as I said, my name's Adam Tinworth. I'm a business journalist by background. I started my professional career working on largely hospitality industry titles, the publican, hotel and restaurant, neither of which are still with us. They've either been closed or merged into their competitors. But possibly I started my career when I was 7 and ran a newspaper for the children on my street. So then did school magazine, college magazines into B2B journalism. And then eventually I transferred and spent the best part of a decade working for Estates Gazette, the big, what used to be the big commercial property trade magazine in the UK, which had a recent near-death experience when Reed nearly shut it down. But it was bought by the Mark Allen Group and apparently is now profitable again, which is something of a relief, because if you can't make money in the commercial property sector, which is kind of rich, you've got problems. But in parallel with that, mainly because I was freelancing for an old university buddy who was editor of one of the gaming titles of Future in Bath, I got online in the late 90s, relatively early, simply because my mate, who sadly now passed on, but Andy sort of pitched me, look, with the next paycheck you get from us, buy yourself a modem. So why the hell would I want to do that? He said, because it gives you 2 extra days on your deadline. Sold. Because at the time I was literally putting copy on a floppy disk and sending it by post. And then when I discovered the internet, I started to get, hang on a second. I can publish more easily to the web myself than our title, which at the time our titles, when I first got on the internet, our titles weren't online. But when I moved to Estates Gazette, they already had a paywall business up and going. As I started discovering blogging software and stuff in the early 2000s, I suddenly realized that something was changing here. And so I started exploring that myself. I've started blogging in 2001, which is terrifyingly nearly 25 years ago. Then in about 2003, I started my current site, One Man and His Blog, which is, yes, a very, very bad pun on one man and his dog, which seemed like a really good idea at the time. And then when you find yourself in Singapore trying to explain to Singaporean journalists why you've called your site that, they just look at you like the British watch. What? Anyway, then in the mid-2000s, Carl Schneider, who at the time was editorial development director at Reed, came looking around the business for anybody who knew about sort of emerging internet stuff. And my boss said at the time, a guy called Peter Bill, who was editor of Estates Gazette at the time, called me in and said, if anyone knows anything about this, it'll be Adam. And they said, do you know anything about blogging or forums or any of this stuff? Because there's even pre-social media. And I went, well, yeah, I've been doing this for about 5 years. And that led to me being seconded initially and then full-time to the centre of Reed to work on digital editorial development. So initially we rolled out a network of blogs across our trade titles. And then as things like Twitter and social media started becoming more and more important, I was involved in a lot of the development of that. I went self-employed in 2012. So 14 years now, which has gone surprisingly quickly. And so now largely I split my time. So half the week I do training and consultancy at my site for various different journalism businesses. And the other half of the week I now work for City St George's in the journalism department as a lecturer, largely in sort of audience and digital skills. I was a VL visiting lecturer there from 2012, actually, from late 2012. But I went on staff 3.5 years ago.
Okay, you answered that like someone who's been asked it before.
Once or twice.
And today's episode is basically, and I've got an immediate question for you, is basically journalism isn't dead. This is the future. And you were just talking about I went self-employed, etc., etc. And the logical thing to say is, but surely there's no money in journalism anymore.
There is money in journalism, but it is changing. I mean, one of the reasons I went, times are harder than they have been. One of the reasons I took full-time work, well, not full-time, half-time work at City St George's, I will learn that eventually, is because, like a lot of people, I had a fairly rough pandemic. I think it'd be fair to say everyone sort of pulled in their budgets, and it was only at the time working with my former training partner, we very rapidly switched to online training, and that just about kept body and soul together. But I thought at the time it might be good to have a little bit more stability in my income as the girls are growing up. And there's definitely less money sloshing around in training budgets than there used to be. But that's partly because, as far as I can see, we are in what looks to me like an inflection point. There's a semi-famous Bill Gates quote about everyone overestimating what impact technology will have in 2 years and underestimating how much it'll have in 10 years. And that we maybe talk about 20-year timescale rather than 10-year timescale in terms of journalism. But I think what seems clear to me, at least, is that we're evolving towards a dramatically different landscape of journalism. Many of the companies that have defined journalism in the past will probably not survive the transition. Some will, a handful will. Most of those are surviving by becoming much bigger sort of international players. You look at things like the New York Times with one business model, or the Guardian with a different business model. But what we're seeing is an industry that's increasingly made up of lots of small little players. I occasionally use the idea of a couple of super cruise ships, the big sort of super tanker of news cruising around, and then like a whole flotilla of medium-sized yachts and small boats, all trying to figure out the business models and the approaches and the journalism styles that will meet people's information needs. And yeah, for all of us in the middle of this transition process, it's somewhere between exciting and absolutely effing terrifying. Mm-hmm. And it does mean that, that's sort of the money that we used to assume was in the business is not as evident as it was. And that means a whole new set of thinking about how we support these businesses and things like that. I was talking to a friend who works for one of the big journalism trade associations a couple of months back before I had a mental accident. And he was saying the same thing, that that even their members, which are largely large, big training company, big news companies, don't have the same sort of budgets for training they did, even 10 years ago. But that's just the very nature of the business training changing, adapting to the changing landscape of digital information distribution.
Do you think, Adam, there's I mean, I accept there's all this, we've got this very disparate landscape now and all these little players, emerging brands in local markets and etc. But I don't think anyone, to my knowledge yet, has come up with any way of actually making that pay.
Well, it depends on what you mean by pay and how big. So if you look at, things like the mill media, they're not making big money, but they're washing their face at the moment. They are growing. And if they can continue to grow subscription bases, then these sort of businesses will survive and thrive. But they will look very different as businesses from the ones that went before. It's Mill Media is never going to look like Reach, even if it sits in some of the same information spaces that Reach does or did sit in.
Shall we just because I know some people who listen to this probably won't have the depth of knowledge of the business that you guys have. Can we just kind of explain what Mill Media is for the layman?
Well, Mill Media is a relatively recent 4 or 5 years, something like that. I lose track, sign of age probably. I lose track of time, how long things happened ago. But it's a local news startup. It started in Manchester, and it has now branches in Sheffield and Glasgow and Birmingham, I think, and a few other places. Initially hosted on Substack, the newsletter platform. More recently, they've transferred to Ghost, which is another similar web and newsletter platform, because the economics work out better. Basically, they keep more of their subscriber revenue from Ghost than they do on Substack. And so the idea is they do, rather than the sort of the traditional local news model, they do 3 or 4 deeply reported stories a week. A couple of those are free, the rest are for paid subscribers only. And the majority of their revenue is coming from readers. It's a subscription revenue model.
Who's reading? It sounds great. That does sound great. Who's paying? Who's reading?
They know better than I do, clearly. But yeah, obviously, slightly better off people in Manchester and who are committed and interested in the community. The challenge that's often thrown at titles like that, and I think there's some justification to it, is because so much of their good reporting is locked behind a paywall. It reduces some of the accessibility of local journalism, which I think is a problem.
Yeah, it's something we've talked about on here before, isn't it? That actually, if everything's behind a paywall, does news become the province of just the wealthy? And is it a case that the poor people don't get any news anymore, or the super engaged? Yeah.
And it also leaves a massive market gap that politically motivated mis and disinformation can move into. Yes, absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the rise of the conspiracy theory.
It's one of the business models that works, but what it doesn't do is support, big HR department, big IT departments, because they don't actually really need an IT department. They're using an off-the-shelf hosted product, which covers that all for them. So it's a business that looks much leaner than traditional businesses.
Are they employing journalists, Adam?
Yes, they are. So each of their regional titles has 3 or 4 journalists working for them.
Salaried?
Yes.
Well,
that's great.
Yeah. That's
the fight back, isn't it? That's the fight back beginning of journalism.
Yeah, it's the beginning of something that will grow into something bigger. Because I think it's worth remembering that most of the titles that we know and love today, the ones that survive, he says, given the first 2 titles I worked on professionally are now both gone. The ones that survived, most of them didn't start as big titles. They grew and evolved that way. So we are in this position where, a lot of, I used the metaphor recently of a controlled wildfire. And I was asked by a friend who'd lived in places where wildfires actually happen to say controlled wildfire, because they're obviously quite sensitive about what wildfires can do. But the controlled wildfire, where a lot of old businesses whose cost structures and ways of working can't transition successfully into the digital area, are disappearing, and new businesses are starting up. Now, the majority of those new businesses will fail, but we don't need them all to succeed. We need enough of them to succeed to sort of repopulate the news ecosystem after the wildfire that's been sweeping through it.
Adam, do you think that if that's an example, and I could see that happening as well, that those sort of businesses will gradually scale to a certain level where they become, profitable concerns? Is there a world you can imagine where some of the bigger players in the industry survive, but they have to scale down significantly, almost to become something like that as well?
Possibly. I think it's very, very difficult for big players to scale down. It is, big businesses find it very hard to become smaller businesses. So if you look at my own background, the B2B sector, my former employer, Reed, survived not by scaling down or scaling down and moving towards journalism. It changed its business model entirely and became much more of a data and services provider, and now does relatively little journalism. It's not really a journalism business in the traditional sense anymore. And I will get emails probably from former friends who are still there, who are still doing journalism, for saying that. But compared to what it was when I sort of moved into that central editorial development role 20 years ago, where it was stuffed full of journalists, it's not really a journalism business anymore. And that's because if you're a sort of publicly listed company that has to hit profit targets, they could see very clearly that journalism wasn't going to be the direction that did that, but they could still maintain their sort of central role of supporting businesses with information by doing other stuff. So scaling down is hard, but what we are seeing is businesses sort of adapting bits and bobs of what's going on out there to help themselves survive and transition. So this sort of newsletters, I think, is the obvious one. Newsletters started largely as an independent thing. Newsletters used to be owned centrally by parts of business, often marketing parts of business, no disrespect to the marketing parts of the business. And often they were sort of like what I would describe as marketing vomit. Here's everything we've written in one big list, and here's some adverts. Whereas now they're much more sort of communication devices.
That's what Nick used to do.
I concur. They were.
Yeah. And so you see them sort of nicking these bits. The work Sarah Ebner did when she was at the Financial Times was fascinating when she was head of their newsletters there, as sort of, taking those examples and saying, actually, let's take one or two of our journalists who have real public personas and give them newsletters as if they were on Substack. And see if we can find a way of bringing in additional revenue and maintaining subscriber growth and stuff in that. So I think we're going to end up with quite a disparate industry. We're going to have these big players, we're going to have these smaller players, and we're going to have a sort of, like so much else, that sort of the middle ground has been really badly hollowed out. But over time, stuff will grow into it, hopefully.
Are the smaller players going to struggle to take on the big business for fear of getting sued because they've not got the money there?
We're already seeing we're already seeing that in little bits. There's an ongoing court case, I think, in London involving Mill Media, where they don't have the same sort of financial resources that the big companies did. So there is this sort of uncomfortable middle ground at the moment. And I'm not, when I say journalism isn't dead, I'm not saying that journalism isn't in a difficult state right now. What I'm saying is that I see light at the end of the tunnel. It just is quite a way off, and we may have to dodge a couple of trains on the way to it. And so, yes, we are clearly seeing that problem. Alternatively, you are starting to see some interesting things start to emerge. So there was a recent investigation by several titles in the Mill Media Group where they looked at the local aspect of a story that had national implications. And you start to see a very different model of what national journalism could look like. It's happening in an aggregate of what's happening in local titles. But again, we're incredibly early days in this. We're only 5 years into a model that may or may not survive. There was a time, maybe 10 years ago, when we were looking at BuzzFeed's news team in London as a sort of a growing force in political journalism, and that all exploded because the business economics of it just didn't work. So there's going to be experiments, some of which are interesting and succeed, and some of which are interesting and fail spectacularly.
Well, it'd be interesting. I mean, Reach, my old employer, it'll be interesting to see how their transformation accelerates or succeeds. Because I mean, both Nick and I were there when we saw lots of projects start and fail. Some start and succeed. But it's 4 or 5 years since I was there, and I think still the vast majority of revenue in Reach is coming from print, 75 to 80%, I think. So at some point, you've actually got to hope, for the sake of journalism, haven't you, that Reach's diversification succeeds, whether that be in video or whatever it is that something starts to pay the bills.
I mean, if I was to be slightly controversial, I would say you have to hope it either succeeds and they find a model that works, or it collapses completely and leaves space for new things to come up and replace the places where they have still quite a large stranglehold on the information. And obviously, for the sake of everybody there, I would hope for the former rather than the latter. But it's, it is an uncomfortable position. The Reach clearly, I've been tracking Reach for a long time as well, although I've never worked with or for them. But they have had so many changes of direction, and finding something that's going to work long term seems to have been very difficult for them.
Do you think Reach's problem is they're trying to do new media, but with an old media funding model? So they're still trying to sell advertising when actually, if you're clicking online, you can just skip all the adverts.
Well, it used to be with an old media cost base as well.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think there's a strong part of that. You know, when I said earlier that it's difficult for big businesses to become small businesses, part of that is it's very hard for them to wind down the support cost based, and that's the thing. You know, if you've got a big IT department, it's a brave CEO that says, actually, we're going to lay off that entire department apart from the people who service the PCs, and we're just going to publish everything on Substack or Ghost or Beehive or any of these platforms.
And HR departments aren't going to say, we can get rid of the HR department, are they?
Well, I was going to say,
sadly not.
It's also my very last Reed Awards. Reed Awards I went at before I left the company. I remember there was a sort of CEO special awards, the HR department, and we were all sort of clapping as they went on stage. And as they kept coming, you could see every single editorial team slowing down their clapping as they slowly worked out how many people their title had to support based on how big the HR team was. And it's those sort of problems that it's really difficult for big companies to unwind.
It's also
they've got shareholders.
Yeah, no. Exactly. It's also a classic business problem that as well, isn't it? It's not just relative to the news industry. It's any business that can see an emerging market. You know, they're not oblivious to emerging markets and changing consumer behaviour. They can see it, but they can't pivot to it easily enough because they're too afraid or reluctant to give up on the existing revenue model.
Yes.
And ultimately, history has proven across any business sector that business that does that will fail. You know, be it Kodak or Nokia or one of these behemoths who once had market dominance and they couldn't move to something new. That's the worry I think with it is that to your point, Adam. Do we end up with a scenario where we have to lay waste to some of these organisations to allow something new to emerge? I suppose.
I think that will happen anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's happening, and certainly if we sort of spread our eyes beyond the UK, if you look at America, I mean, America now has vast swathes of what people tend to call news deserts, places where the local media has just collapsed, and the startup media is starting to build itself and come through. The problem there is there was sort of almost a lag, if you like, the old media collapsed. But the easy technology, the off-the-shelf technology to allow them to build the new models wasn't there yet. A lot of the sort of renaissance we're seeing in new startups is based on these sort of platforms like Substack and Ghost to Beehive, which I keep talking about. I mean, what people tend to tweak about Substack is its name. Its name sort of is a shortening of subscription stack. It's this idea that it's a technology for publishing content, but also taking subscriptions for that content. It's all there in one package. You don't need to worry about it. You connect it to Stripe. You start publishing. All the technology, all the payments are handled for you. And then you can just get going and start generate revenue. And Ghost and Beehive and the other players in this space are all doing the same thing. Whereas even the previous wave of technology, stuff like WordPress, to make this work, you need WordPress, but then you also needed to plug in Memberful, and then maybe you needed to plug in a newsletter sending package, and you had to sort of bodge it all together. Now it's all there. It's in one platform. That's all abstracted away for you. You can concentrate on growing the audience and growing the content, and hopefully the revenue will follow. Now, for a lot of people, it doesn't. Like anything on the internet, it tends to follow the sort of long tail rule, where a handful of things take a lot of money, and then there's lots which don't ever really make any money. Podcasts has another one, very much like that.
Don't we know it?
Yes, but this is what's making the difference. That the technology is now there to experiment easily, cheaply, and quickly, and if it starts paying off, then you can grow it.
Well, I guess all the great American newspapers, didn't they? They all started invariably as one man who decided he was going to start a newspaper and wherever, and that's why you had all those American newspapers with fantastic names, wasn't it? Because they just plucked them out of nowhere.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's very few of them left now, aren't there? In their old form.
Yes, and either they've been absorbed into some of the bigger companies which are now running them on a shoestring, or they're just gone.
And I get, I think I mean, there is still some semblance of local journalism. I liked it in your blog. You called it the zombie of local journalism. There's some of that still around in the UK, isn't it? But
I find it frustrating because about the time that I went self-employed was when we moved from London down to the south coast of Sussex, which is where we live now. And actually, this is the first time since I left Scotland, where I grew up, where I actually cared about the place I lived. And I'm interested in finding out what's happening in the local news. But the whole time I've been here, the local journalism has been in a parlous state. There was one brief time, there was a very good local reporter who was working on the Shoreham Herald, or what's left of it, as part of a wider group.
Yeah.
And she was very smart and did some very good work, but that was the exception. And every time, the two things that get me is, A, whenever I actually click to a story on the site, it's, I get a couple of lines and then 3 or 4 ads, and then a couple of lines and 3 or 4 ads. And the experience is just horrible.
It's atrocious, isn't it?
It's horrendous, yeah. It's almost unreadable nowadays, isn't it?
And the other one is the clickbait. I mean, they're still doing clickbait at this point in time, drives me up the wall. But first time I got caught was I saw in a newsletter or something, an email or something, the local surgery to close. And I was really like, oh, fuck. Really? It's hard enough to get an appointment as it is. Oh, well, let me just see. And I click on it, and it's Littlehampton. And I think, great. Local's doing a lot of work there. That's like 7 towns down the coast. In an abstract way, I feel sorry for the people of Littlehampton, but you've just tricked me into clicking on it by using Local, and you've pissed me off.
Yeah.
And actually, you've just made me, for the few pennies you got for the ad views you got out of me, you've just made me significantly less likely to ever click on a link again. And several years later, they got me another one with like local roads gridlocked because of murder. I was like, oh no, yeah, okay, you got me again, you bastard. Sorry, language. But since then, I don't really want to support the site because I want good local journalism to be happening, but the combination of the disrespect for my time and the horrible experience that trying to make the ad model work for them is just not stacking up.
Well, I'm old enough to remember, we were trained never to use the word local. Far too general. You always had to use a place name, so local as a word was banned.
Ah, right. So you'd have to say like Plymstock person.
Yeah, Plymstock man.
Yeah.
Never local man because it was too woolly
and
too misleading.
Which is exactly why they're doing it nowadays.
Now it's all
nowadays, it's supposed to be misleading. That's
You're
the point.
trying to mislead.
Yeah.
But I would, as somebody who teaches digital journalism and has done for nearly 20 years now, I would argue this is just fundamentally bad practice. The big thing that most of these startup businesses that survive understand, and increasingly we're seeing the big publishers who are building, audience revenue models are understanding, is that you have to respect and you have to build a rapport with the audience. Now, in a sense, I'm sort of pre-biased, not the wrong word. I'm pre-inclined to view the world in this way because I came from B2B publishing. And the interesting thing about B2B publishing is always that the people you are reporting for are the same people you are reporting on. And it tends to keep you ruthlessly honest as a journalist, because if you're too easy on the industry, they'll let you know. And if you're too hard on the industry, they'll let you know. And you have to walk this very narrow line that keeps everything stacked up. And it was one of the things I actually really enjoyed about, particularly my time on the Estates Gazette, when it was still a big enough title that they had a sort of regional features team, which I was on for a while. I got to spend 1 or 2 days a week traveling to different parts of the country and interviewing all the local commercial property people there. I have particularly vivid memories of going into some industrial units with a female industrial surveyor, and her just getting very excited about this particular user. She was just like, oh, look at the eaves height on this property. It's just these eaves height are wonderful. Yeah, the characters you meet as you go around the characters, stuff like that. So, in a very clear sense that we had to maintain the relationship with it. And one of my great unwritten pieces for my blog is, where did things go wrong for Estates Gazette with its sort of near-death experience? Actually, one of the things I think they did is, as the advertising revenue for the regional pieces declined, they sort of dropped a lot of their regional reporting over time. the problem with that is that you suddenly started giving large swathes of the country a good reason to stop buying your magazine. And then you end up in this sort of downward spiral if you're only looking at the ad revenue that's coming across all things and not thinking about the second and third order effects by starting to neglect more and more of the community countrywide. So a lot, what that sort of ad-based clickbait attention-grabbing stuff is doing is basically saying eyeballs don't really matter as long as we get them. But as soon as you are starting getting people to pay, then it's why so many people now talk about membership models rather than subscription models, because there is a relationship you have to build. One of my particular threads on teaching is what I call audience strategy. And we tend to get people going into the emergent audience teams on some of the big publishers. One of the things that we were doing 20 years ago with Reed was we were hiring community managers for our titles. So we had a community manager for States Gazette, we had a community manager for Farmers Weekly, and so on. And over time, those job roles sort of evolved into social media managers, and they became more of a get clicks role rather than a managed community role. But one of my students from 2 years ago, Ariel, she was hired as a community manager again on the Telegraph. And they've got an audience team and a community team as well as a social media team, because maintaining as more and more of their revenue is coming from readers, from audience members, rather than from advertising, that's become more important to them. And I think she's now working for Wired at Condé Nast over in the States, again, doing similar audience building stuff. So this is my fundamental problem. It's not just about the business model being broken, but it's how the business model's demands end up breaking your relationship with the audience. And because so many of these startups I'm talking about are deriving their early revenue, the early revenue that gets them through the early stages of development is based on relationship. There was one of the media sites, I forget which, and I'm still kicking myself to this day that I never screenshotted it. But I saw they did a big investigation into some stuff that was happening with leasehold properties in the area. And one of the comments was, this is exactly why I pay for your journalism, that you stand up and fight for people in the local area doing this. And that's the sort of thing that it sounds all very idealistic and white knighty at some level. But I do think it is part of the future that we have to rebuild. So, and how to put this carefully without pissing off people from my past.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah, they're the past. Suddenly, when I first joined the States Gazette many years ago, there were a certain proportion of the journalists who worked for it who really looked down on their audience. And they were always taking the mickey out of commercial property surveyors, who are sort of the core paying audience of the States Gazette. And I always struggle with that, because I thought, these are the guys who are paying they or their businesses. And when I say guys, commercial property, it is largely guys. I once went to a property awards and sort of looked down from the balcony of the Grosvenor House. It's like this sea of men in tux, and about 3 women, 2 of whom were States Gazette reporters, who, by virtue, to be fair, of being very few women there, were very good at getting stories out of slightly drunk men. But that's a whole other conversation. But I thought, these are the guys who are paying for your life, and paying quite well. I mean, States Gazette back in the day paid very well. It's one of the reasons I stayed there. I was offered the job of editor of a consumer technology title in Bournemouth, of all places. And though I didn't mind the idea of moving to Bournemouth, I did mind taking quite a big pay cut from being features editor of a business magazine to being editor of a consumer mag title, which is why I stayed at EG until the sort of internal development work rolled. But yeah, that fundamental respect, that fundamentally the reason I don't think journalism will die is because I think there is still a fundamental need for any functioning society, and whether that's a political society in terms of the country, or a local region, or a business community, or a hobby community, there's a fundamental need for that community to have, at some level, reliable information. And it may take time, and the models that emerge might look very different, but they will still happen. I mean, consumer magazine journalism, one of the things that surprised me is I've ended up sort of exploring a few new hobbies, or in one case, an old hobby. When I was a teenager in Scotland a long time ago, I was involved in Warhammer in the very early days, and then I grew up and abandoned it for 30 years. But of all things, my younger daughter, not something I would have believed 30 years ago, my younger daughter has brought me back in. But they're discovering there's a vast network of media around the hobby, but its vast majority of it is on YouTube. Handful of blogs and newsletters, but the vast majority of it's on YouTube. But that is hobby media. That is consumer media as we know it.
Is it free?
Most of it is free because it's YouTube. They're making money off generating enough views they can bring in the ad revenue. Some of them are full-time, some of them are part-time. Those that are full-time tend to have 2 or 3 other revenue streams that might include selling supplies or other things, or it might involve events or other stuff. And so, that's, many of us will recognize that as a classic business model. You sort of build up through one stream, YouTube views, and then maybe you have a members program, and then you have an events business, and then you have merch. Most of these businesses will start off with pure audience revenue and then start adding things like events or merch or whatever else it might be in that context. And so, the hobby media still exists. It just doesn't look like the magazines I pored over when I was a teenager, and which is what sort of made me fall in love with journalism in the first place.
So, going right back to where we were a little bit earlier in the conversation, how do we get journalism back so that it is available to everyone and everyone wants to read it and not go off into their own little bunkers and have their own little conspiracy theory type areas to get their news from?
And that's almost slightly 2 different questions. So can I address the second one first and come back to the first one? So the first one is almost inherently a problem of the internet. Because the one thing we've probably all realized is that what the internet makes is makes publishing information incredibly easy. And therefore, there is, in any place and time, an overwhelming amount of information coming at us.
And misinformation.
And misinformation and disinformation and all the rest of it, I was once at a conference where somebody memorably described this as the tidal wave of shit coming at all of us, amongst which there is some gems that we have to try and find. One of the problems is that the gems are different for everybody. I occasionally I baffle and confuse my students by talking about my early days on the States Gazette when I was getting on a train, and I'd go into Smith's at Euston, say, and buy a newspaper and a magazine, and I get halfway to Hull, and I've read them both. What do I do? And they say, "Well, you get your phone out." So, okay, got my phone out. What do I do? Browse the internet. So, no, it's 1997. I can play Snake. And I go, "Oh, all right, okay. Well, get your laptop out." Okay, laptop's out. Connect to the Wi-Fi. Yeah, 1997. No Wi-Fi yet.
In fairness, you're on a train. There's no Wi-Fi now.
Yeah, well, that's true, yes. The Thameslink Wi-Fi I use can work about 1 time in 5. And I guess they suddenly dawned on them that I could run out of stuff to read. For most of them, this is not an experience they've ever had in their life.
No, indeed.
But one of the responses we know people have to this is what we call the flight to niche. That when you have overwhelming information coming at you, you tend to narrow down to your particular niche. And so, as a hobby photographer, which has sort of become part of my working life, once upon a time I would buy general photography magazines, but online people tend to read quite sort of niche or watch very niche channels about their style of photography or their style of cameras. And again, sorry to take the mickey out of Reach a little bit, but I remember, we've seen the sort of the growth of the hyperlocal in regional media. But I remember Reach once saying, we're setting up a local hub for Cornwall. I was going, that's not really hyperlocal. Truro might be hyperlocal, Cornwall not so much. And it's one of those problems with with my local sites where they've taken the Shoreham Herald and whatever the Littlehampton one was calling, and they've merged them all together. Well, I don't really care what's happening in Littlehampton, but I really care what's happening in Shoreham, and that's a push Worthing, if you make me, and maybe Stenning, but that's all I care about. So the flight to niche and people's tendency to get into little bubbles is unavoidable to some degree, but the way is where we find points of connection, because there are still national issues that affect all of us, and making those economics stack up. I still think there's something fundamentally unbalanced in the news ecosystem, because actually, if you look at the number of stories I care about in my business life, it's quite a lot per day. The number of stories I care about in my personal life, whether it's my hobbies or where I live, is quite a lot per day, because they have direct impact on me. The number of national news stories I care about on a day is 2 or 3, if you're lucky. However, if you look at the amount of volume of national news stories compared to the local news stories being compared, it's the wrong way around. That's a structural problem I think we're in the process of working out, but it's going to take a lot of time. So I think we're going to end up with a small number of very big publishers addressing sort of national issues. Building those trust relationships is something we've got to redo, because you see that in one of the places the misinformation, so intentional disinformation. Misinformation is accidental, disinformation is intentional. Where disinformation breeds is by disrupting trust in traditional media, and then sort of filling that gap. And that's another good reason that we've got to build these audience relationships better than we have been doing in the past. So that sort of bit is almost inevitable. However, we do need to build strong, resilient journalism businesses to make sure that we can continue to do the important journalism that matters. And so some of those startups either need to find ways of sort of, thank you, Watch. Some of those businesses either need to grow to be more substantial businesses to be able to do that sort of thing, or at some point some sort of amalgamation of businesses to build the sort of conglomerates of the past. And again, coming from B2B, most of the big B2B companies actually arose out of acquiring lots of titles that were independent businesses originally. It was actually until Reed bought it, the States Gazette was its own title, its own business run by a family firm. It was bought into Reed and then eventually sold to the Mark Allen Group. So it's only on its third set of owners in nearly 200 years of history. So there's a whole ecosystem rebalancing and recreation that I think we're going through. And honestly, I'm in my mid-50s. I'm not expecting to see the end of that ecosystem rebalancing. I think we are talking about a decades-long transition that is going to be incredibly painful at times. But
it'll probably never end now, will it? Because it'll be so dependent on technological development. And
I think you're spot on. I think unless there's some reason why technological change slows down dramatically, I think we are moving towards a period of continual evolution. I'm now old enough to remember the period when we were just sort of thinking, okay, we've done it. We figured out how to publish to print and the web at the same time. Hurrah! We made the transition. And then mobile comes along, and then social media comes along, and then it's like, oh, it's like being punched repeatedly just when you think you've won the fight.
Yeah,
I think you're probably right. I think there may not be an eventual transition, but I think there is going to be a bleaker period of time, maybe for the rest of this decade, while more of the old businesses start to fail, and we are waiting for the newer businesses to grow.
Well, let's look forward to seeing that, or maybe be interested in seeing that happen rather than look forward to it. Yeah, exactly. I think we've come to the end of our time. Thank you very much for coming on the show, Adam. That was a really interesting sort of exploration of where the future might lie for journalism. And I'm sure we'll come back to it at some point or other. We've got to our 45-minute limit, so that's a long episode for us. We'll call it a special.
As my students are quite aware, I am quite capable of gobbing on about this.
So thank you to Adam Tinworth. Thank you, Bill and Nick. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Adam.
Bye for now. Thanks,
Bye.
Adam.
Cheerio.